Welcome back to the final session in our video series, Cycle of Grace. Trevor, I found your insights on the flow of grace very helpful. I worked for a number of years in an inner city mission in Dallas, and burnout was something that we all faced each and every day. What I find helpful in this discussion of the cycle of grace is how God's grace is not just at the beginning, but all the way through. Sometimes at the end of a very long day, I can be tired and wonder where I'm headed, but I know that God has been at work through me and my colleagues.
Thank you, Sarah, for sharing your experience in that mission congregation in the inner city. I think it also could be helpful for me to emphasize that the cycle of grace doesn't only apply to our individual life, but can also apply to our life as a congregation. That sometimes it's helpful to reflect on our life as a congregation and to see whether it's caught up in a cycle of grace or in a cycle of works. Is the congregation that I'm part of, is it conveying acceptance? Is it providing opportunities for sustenance? Does it give significance to people? And does it have a flow out of grace into the life of the community?
I think of what you're saying, Trevor, as being that does the congregation have a cycle of grace or does it have a cycle of works? And I think that issue is there for individuals as well as for the congregation, like you mentioned. The term that comes to my mind is the term the rule of life, and that's something that Christian spiritual practice, we've used that a long time. And that whole notion of having some kind of way of looking at our lives and how we live in relationship to God, and then measuring that against something that helps us to have the balance that we need. There's another word for rule of life, and that has to do with a trellis. It's sometimes thought of not so much like a bunch of rules, like a bunch of laws, but more like a trellis that holds up the plant and helps the plant to grow and to be sustained. So for us as individuals and for us as a congregation, what helps us to grow in our discipleship and in our leadership so that we're not just stuck in one time period, but we're continuing to mature as Christian leaders. That's what I find exciting about the cycle of grace.
Trevor, what would you say about the notion that engaging people in ministry is the best entry point for new Christians? In some ways, it sounds like putting fruitfulness first. Say a pastor decides to involve people in ministry to the homeless before they join the congregation. Does that suggest the cycle of works instead of the cycle of grace?
Not at all, Sarah. I think that a person can enter the life of the congregation at any point in the cycle of grace. For example, as you were saying, maybe someone signs up to be part of a ministry to the homeless or with the homeless, and that could be a point of entrance. Or, for example, let's say someone goes on a retreat in the congregation and they come into the life of the congregation through the sustenance that that congregation is providing to its members. So I think one can enter the congregation at any point in the cycle of grace. I think the point that this resource model makes is how are we actually living? Are we living within a cycle of grace? In other words, are we living out of a sense of identity? Are we finding sustenance and then out of that input giving ourselves to others? Or are we desperately trying to create our identity through a reliance upon works? I think the ultimate question is how we are living. One, I think, can enter the congregation at any point in the cycle of grace.
That is so helpful. Thank you. Trevor, Jerry, thank you for sharing these thoughts on the cycle of grace and how it can keep our ministries fresh and life-giving. These sessions have been inspiring, and we look forward to learning more from your book, Cycle of Grace. When our ministries draw their strength from God's unconditional love and acceptance, there's a flow of grace that constantly refreshes and renews us. We can avoid bitterness and burnout when we remember we are God's beloved, and when we remember that God's grace is a sustaining power and presence throughout our lives. Thanks to all of you who have viewed our video series, whether at home or in a group setting. We hope that the cycle of grace will enrich your walk with Christ.